There is someone quietly ruining your future. He has your voice, he knows your fears, and he understands exactly how to convince you that tomorrow is a better day to begin. And every time you listen to him, your life becomes a little smaller. You call it procrastination, a lack of discipline, bad habits. But what if none of those are the real problem? What if the greatest obstacle standing between you and the life you want isn't outside you, but hidden inside the very mind you trust? Most people believe failure happens because of a lack of talent, opportunity, or intelligence. Yet you've probably seen people who are intelligent waste their potential. You've watched disciplined people suddenly abandon years of progress. Maybe you've done it yourself. You promise yourself that this time will be different. You decide you'll wake up earlier. You'll finally start that project. You'll stop returning to the same destructive habits. For a moment, the future feels close enough to touch. Then something changes. You tell yourself you're tired. You need more time. You'll start on Monday. The opportunity quietly passes, and somehow the excuse feels reasonable. That's the strange part. You don't lie to yourself with obvious falsehoods. You lie with believable stories. And because they're believable, you never notice they're lies. This is where most explanations stop. They tell you to work harder, become more disciplined, stay motivated. But those answers ignore an uncomfortable question. If you truly want success, why do you keep choosing the opposite? That question haunted one philosopher more than almost any other, not because he wanted to teach success, but because he wanted to understand why human beings so often become enemies of their own happiness. Long before psychology existed as a science, Arthur Schopenhauer proposed something unsettling. He believed that what we call choice is often only the final scene of a much deeper drama. The actor standing on the stage believes he is directing the play, but the script was already written somewhere beneath the stage. At first, that sounds impossible. After all, you experience yourself making decisions every day. You choose what to eat, who to speak to, whether to work or rest. It feels as though your conscious mind is firmly holding the steering wheel. But appearances can be deceptive. Imagine standing beside a river. On the surface, the water seems calm, and you could almost believe it chooses its own direction. Yet, beneath the surface, an invisible current decides everything, and the leaves floating above have no idea what is carrying them. Schopenhauer believed the human mind works in much the same way. Our thoughts are the leaves, our deeper drives are the current, and the frightening part is that the leaves often mistake themselves for the river. Think about the last time you delayed something important. Maybe you told yourself you weren't inspired. Maybe the timing wasn't right. Maybe you convinced yourself you perform better under pressure. Those explanations felt logical, but ask yourself something uncomfortable. Did those reasons come first, or did they arrive only after you had already decided to avoid the task? This is one of the mind's greatest illusions. We imagine reason as the king. Schopenhauer believed reason is often the lawyer. It doesn't decide the verdict. It simply defends whatever decision has already been made by forces we barely recognize. Suddenly, self-sabotage begins to look different. You're not always failing because you lack knowledge. You're failing because another part of you has interests that your conscious mind refuses to acknowledge, and hidden conflicts are far more dangerous than visible ones. Imagine an archer trying to hit a target while someone quietly nudges his arm at the exact moment he releases the arrow. He keeps missing, so he buys a better bow, practices longer, studies better techniques. Yet the arrows still drift away from the center because he keeps solving the wrong problem. Many people spend years improving their skills while ignoring the invisible hand moving the arrow. They become more efficient without becoming more honest with themselves. This hidden force doesn't always speak with fear. Sometimes it speaks with comfort. It whispers, "You deserve a break. One day won't matter. You've already worked hard. Its voice sounds compassionate, and that's why it's so persuasive. If temptation arrived looking like destruction, almost nobody would follow it. Instead, it arrives wearing the mask of kindness. Comfort rarely announces itself as your enemy. It introduces itself as your friend, and slowly, almost invisibly, it begins negotiating away your future one small compromise at a time. This is why self-sabotage almost never feels dramatic. It feels reasonable. The person destroying his potential isn't usually making catastrophic decisions. He's making comfortable ones every single day. Schopenhauer argued that beneath all our rational explanations exists something deeper, an irrational striving he called the will. Not willpower in the modern sense, something far more fundamental. A blind force that constantly pushes us toward immediate desires, familiar patterns, and instinctive comforts. Reason doesn't disappear, it simply becomes a storyteller. It explains why the impulse was correct after the impulse has already taken control. Once you see this pattern, an unsettling realization begins to emerge. Perhaps the greatest prison is not ignorance, it is unconscious obedience. Because you cannot fight an enemy you mistake for your own voice. And that raises a far more important question. If your mind can invent convincing stories to protect your hidden desires, how many of your ambitions actually belong to you? And how many were quietly abandoned long before you believed you had made a choice? The answer begins with the realization most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Self-sabotage is rarely an event, it is an identity. Look closely at someone who repeatedly abandons their goals, and you'll notice something strange. Their failures often appear different on the surface, but they are connected by the same invisible thread. One project ends because the timing wasn't right. A relationship ends because they weren't understood. A habit disappears because life became too busy. Different stories, the same ending. The mind changes the scenery while the hidden pattern remains untouched. Imagine walking through a labyrinth. Every turn looks new, every corridor feels different. Yet, hours later, you find yourself standing in the exact place where you began. That is how unconscious patterns survive. They don't repeat your circumstances, they repeat your responses. This is why changing jobs rarely changes an undisciplined mind, why moving to another city cannot outrun insecurity, why a new notebook never creates a new character. A different environment may delay the pattern, but only awareness can break it. Schopenhauer believed human beings suffer because they mistake temporary satisfaction for lasting freedom. The will is never satisfied. Feed one desire and another quietly appears. Escape one discomfort and the mind immediately begins avoiding the next. Think about how often you've promised yourself, once I finish this, then I'll become disciplined. Once the life settles down, then I'll start. The destination keeps moving not because success is impossible, but because the mind has learned to postpone the moment it must confront itself. The tragedy is not that people fail. The tragedy is that they become experts at explaining why failure was inevitable. Every explanation protects the identity they already have. Because changing your behavior is difficult, changing your identity feels dangerous. The old self whispers, if you truly commit, you'll have no excuse left. That sentence hides more fear than most people realize. Failure hurts, but discovering your own limits hurts even more. As long as you never fully commit, you never have to answer the question, what if I gave everything and still wasn't enough? So the mind chooses a safer pain. It chooses unfinished dreams over tested ability. Not because unfinished dreams are satisfying, but because they preserve hope without demanding courage. This is the invisible bargain of self-sabotage. You protect your image of who you could become by never risking who you actually are. Notice how subtle this becomes. The hidden enemy no longer says, give up. It says, prepare a little longer. Wait for better conditions. Research one more strategy. There is wisdom in preparation, but there is also a point where preparation becomes camouflage for fear. Only brutal honesty can tell the difference. So how do you escape a force that sounds exactly like your own thoughts? Not by trying to silence every impulse, not by waiting for perfect motivation, but by learning to interrupt the story before it becomes behavior. The next time you catch yourself creating a convincing excuse, don't argue with it immediately. Instead, ask one question. What is this excuse protecting? Not what is it saying? What is it protecting? Embarrassment, uncertainty, comfort, or the fear of discovering what you're truly capable of? That single question shifts your attention away from the story and toward the hidden current beneath it. And once the current becomes visible, it loses much of its power. This is where philosophy becomes practical. Awareness is not passive observation. It is an act of psychological resistance. Every moment you recognize an unconscious pattern before obeying it, you weaken the invisible force that has quietly directed your life. Not through force, but through clarity, because clarity breaks spells. Imagine standing before two doors every morning. One door is familiar, behind it waits comfort, delay, and another day that looks exactly like yesterday. The other door offers uncertainty, effort, the possibility of failure. But it is also the only door through which transformation can enter. Most people believe the difficult door becomes easier with time. It doesn't. You simply become someone who no longer waits for ease before acting. That is the transformation, not becoming fearless, but becoming unwilling to let fear decide. Schopenhauer never promised a life free from struggle. In fact, he believed struggle was woven into existence itself. But there is a profound difference between suffering unconsciously and suffering in pursuit of something worthy. One shrinks your world, the other expands it. So, perhaps success is not the opposite of self-sabotage. Perhaps success begins the moment you stop believing every thought that speaks in your own voice, because not every voice in your mind deserves your obedience. Some were built from old fears, some from comfort, some from habits repeated so often they now wear the disguise of identity. Your task is not to destroy them. Your task is to recognize them before they choose for you. The person who keeps sabotaging their own success believes they are fighting the world. The person who begins to awaken realizes the battle was never out there. It was between the life they consciously desired and the unconscious patterns they quietly served. From this day forward, watch your excuses as carefully as your ambitions. One reveals the future you dream about, the other reveals the future you are actually creating. And when those two finally become the same, you will no longer need to chase success, because you will have become the kind of person who stops abandoning themselves the moment the path becomes difficult. That is where every lasting victory begins.